Hello, and welcome to the Distillery. I'm your host, Harry Lee Shanglun. Today we have special guest, Ida Kubiszewski. Hi, Ida. How are you
Hey,
doing?
hey, good. How you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. I'm calling from Narm, or Melbourne, which is the traditional lands of the people of the Kulin Nation. And whereabouts are you calling from?
I'm currently in Canberra, so across the lake from Parliament.
Oh yeah, is that where, do you mean New Parliament or Old Parliament House?
Both. So there's New Parliament House, New Parliament House, Old Parliament House, the lake, and then I'm just across the way. So don't get there quite as often as I probably should, but.
I was around in that area for a project with the Museum of Australian Democracy. So I think I know exactly which lake you're talking about, which is cool.
Yeah. No, it's a gorgeous area. So it's a beautiful city.
Ida, you're an associate professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU in Canberra. And your kind of specialty is in ecosystem services and everything to do with that environmental evaluation stuff. How did you get into that?
Well, so I'm actually an ecological economist. So ecosystem services is a part of that, and it's quite a few things that kind of relate to that. I got into it a little bit by accident, and from sort of a different side. I really liked reading sci-fi when I was younger, and so when it was time to decide what to do at school, what to major in, I decided I'd major in astrophysics. And so that kind of, I know it's a weird jump, but it worked for me. And through physics and astronomy, I learned that I loved solving problems, taking a big complex problem, splitting it out, putting it together. And I've always had an interest in the environment. And so that led me to sort of energy and environmental studies. And then that led me to ecological economics, ecosystem services as that part, but very much from the solutions perspective. So taking sort of an environmental problem and realizing that, and this is what ecological economics do, and realizing that it has social, economic, and environmental implications in whatever you do. So kind of looking at a whole system perspective and the solutions from a whole system.
So you're not limiting yourself to just one domain. You're noticing that all of these problems cross over lots of different disciplines, lots of different, I guess, values of what we consider valuable.
Right. You can't solve any of our global problems, whether it's inequality or climate change, or our economic problems, by looking at them from one discipline. You need a whole range of disciplines working together and finding unique and innovative, creative solutions on how to do it. And the interesting thing is that if you do tweak one part of the system, everything else will tweak in some way. And so how do we solve these where it's a solution for the whole system and not just creating more problems in other aspects?
Did your training as an astrophysicist prepare you well for this kind of thinking, which seems like such a huge magnitude of scale?
It does in some way. Physics is very good at training you how to solve problems. And it's not the only discipline that does that training. And it's only one way of solving problems. And there's a lot of different ways of solving problems. But it was really good at saying, well, if you do have a large problem, you can break it up and look at it and make it manageable. And I feel like a lot of times I'm using that skill to look at climate change and just make it manageable. Otherwise, it's impossible. When I started a physics degree, I remember the professor, the first day of class, say, only actually about 1% of you will be in a physics related field in 20 years. We're not here to teach you physics. We're here to teach you how to solve problems. And that really stuck with me. So, yeah.
That's awesome. I wish I had done that kind of course. And you've mentioned this word solutions a lot, partially maybe as a subliminal messaging for a journal that you co-founded and edit. But can you tell us more about what you mean by solutions?
Sure. So yes, you're right. A group of us co-founded a publication called Solutions. It's a hybrid between an academic journal and a for-public magazine. So for a long time it was on newsstands. I believe it is again, but it is peer-reviewed, so it's accurate. The science is very accurate. It's not dumbed down, but it's written in a language where educated audience will understand it. So just to plug it, the website is thesolutionsjournal.com. So you could go and take a look. And the cool thing about each article in that publication is that no more than about a third of it can be about the problem, and 2/3 can, perfect, thank you. And 2/3 of it has to be about a solution. And there's, of course, many, many solutions out there. And so it could be theoretical, but oftentimes it's already one that's been implemented somewhere. And so the idea was, well, if we start sharing these solutions, maybe then other people, other areas, other groups can pick them up and apply them as well. So yeah.
Solutions is like a journal and almost like to public. I'm going to use the word pop sci, but it's communicating science to a public. And it focuses on different problems and solutions that exist around the world.
Yeah.
That sounds so cool.
Yeah, and it's not just science. So it's the humanities, it's policy. So it's sort of looking at a solution from the whole system. So it's not just focusing on, like, okay, here's an environmental problem and just an environmental solution. It's taking the big picture, and that's how it approaches the solution. So currently, I'm an associate editor. The editor-in-chief is Beth Caniglia, who's running it, and it's really thriving. So it's doing really well.
I feel like we're at a juncture in modern history where we are encountering old solutions failing, or there are a lot of problems that we're seeing at the intersection of previous solutions, which maybe were focusing on just like one metric or something. First of all, what do you think about the future-proofing aspect of the solutions being proposed now? And secondly, how do those solutions actually translate to reality?
Yeah. With a lot of these solutions, there's no one or perfect solution, and there's not even a perfect solution at a smaller scale. I think it's important when looking at implementing the solutions to be adaptable. So let's say a policy is made with the understanding, okay, so we're trying this out. We're going to be adaptable. It's going to run for 6 months. We're going to see how it works. And it's okay to make adjustments and changes after 6 months or a year. And I feel like policy, the way it often works now is, let's say a politician proposes a solution. It's not perfect. And all of a sudden he doesn't get reelected, or it gets totally knocked down because it wasn't absolutely perfect the first time. And I think an important part of any solution has to be the ability to adapt and change as we learn and grow. It might have unexpected consequences, positive and negative. So let's use those. Let's keep making sure that the positives won't happen, and how do we mitigate the negative ones? So,
and so, okay, solutions are not just one small thing. They're complex, and we need to have an adaptable approach. So they might not work the first time, but we iterate and we think about how it works contextually.
Yeah, exactly.
And then what is the process of saying, okay, here's a proposed solution to a problem that society has? How does that become policy, or come out of the theory?
Yeah, and it depends, depending on what the solution is and whether it is policy oriented, whether it's business oriented, whether it's the public oriented. So there's different types of solutions. And so with a policy oriented one, you probably need a champion to push it through. That kind of lobbies for it in government and pushes it through in some way, and a politician that's willing to push it through as well. So I think with a lot of these things, it is having that champion around to kind of get it going.
Do you think that governments are listening to scientists and researchers? Like, for example, the current COVID-19 crisis, the Australian government has been both lauded and criticized for its responsiveness and for the way that it relates to scientists.
Yeah. I think, especially in the Trump era, that's changing quite a bit, where knowledge almost brings fear to people in some ways, versus the opposite. And I think a lot of that is a problem. So with COVID, yes, scientists have come in some ways to the forefront. And yet it's also being used politically against both scientists and other politicians. And unfortunately, politics, with whether it's a two-system party or more parties like we have in Australia, politics seems to come first, and that's often a big problem because terms are 3 to 4 years, depending on where you are. And so getting reelected is usually a primary aspect of it, of your motivation and decision making, instead of what's the right thing to do, one, for society, but not just for society, but for society in 50 to 100 years. So that long-term thinking, you know, going back to, let's say, environmental issues, the decisions we make today will have consequences 100 years from now, if not more. So I just recently listened to Will Steffen, who's an internationally renowned climate scientist, and he was giving a talk in one of my classes, and he was saying that at this point, it doesn't look like we can recover the Great Barrier Reef. It's gone too far. That even if we mitigate carbon really quickly, there's a good chance it's going to die. And scientists have been saying that for a while, but it's not convenient for politicians to spend money to make changes. So I think there's an interesting dynamic between scientists and politicians that definitely needs a lot more work.
That's such a tricky problem, though. Like, not just one of politics, but just broadly how we think in terms of scale, whether it's time or space or number of people. Do you have any insight from your discipline into the ways that we meager humans can appreciate these really systemic issues?
I don't know if there's any one single way to tell you the truth. Taking some kind of course on system dynamics and systems, I think every politician should take a course on systems, right?
There should be like education for politicians.
Right. Just basic education, like know how the environment works, know how the environment relates to society and the economy, know that the economy can't be bigger than the environment. It's just against the laws of physics, you know, like just the basics. How does this work? And I think things like that are important and often are missing in a political decision making. That big perspective, that whole systems thinking. And I do think that is super important when making decisions, whether it's on the national scale by politicians or everyday decisions by individuals.
Harking all the way back to the start of our conversation, you mentioned that ecosystem services are kind of the subset of the broader ecological economics that you do. And I'm somewhat familiar with the work that you do through work like that we've collaborated on things like in that dimension. Can you tell us more about what ecosystem services entails?
Sure. So let me just give you a quick definition. So ecosystem services are the benefits that ecosystems provide to humans, basically, right? So the idea that both of us went outside for walks or runs today, right? We probably went to a park or in nature because that benefit us, our mental health, our physical health. That was contribution nature does. And there's more direct contributions that nature provides us. So flood protection, for example, you have a wetland, you get a cyclone going through it. A lot of the water that's coming in is mitigated. So less flooding, carbon sequestration by forests. And then everyday, excuse me, and everyday things like picking an apple off a tree, right? A tree made that, nature made that apple. And so there's various scopes of valuation. And so one of the things I work on basically is how do you value that? How do you value nature and the contributions it provides to us? And there's no perfect way. There's a lot of methodologies depending on the ecosystem, on the service, at what exactly you're looking at. And there's no one method, and even the methods that are there aren't perfect. But what we're trying to say is that they're better than assuming zero, right? So for example, you're making a decision of putting a hotel onto a wetland because obviously that wetland isn't worth anything, right? And it's a beachfront hotel. It's going to bring a lot of tourism, and the wetland doesn't really do anything for us in theory, right? And so what we're trying to do is say, well, since society is accustomed to dealing with trade-offs in monetary units, let's put nature into those monetary units. It doesn't matter what units you use, right? You could use smiles or apples or whatever you want to use, whatever works best for the audience you're speaking with. But unfortunately, with a lot of the audience globally, it is monetary units. So then you're putting that hotel onto a wetland and you're saying, well, okay, what are the costs and benefits? So the benefits will be GDP will grow and infrastructure will grow. Tourism will happen. There will be great views, etc. What are the costs? Well, it's a wetland. It's not worth anything. There are no costs, right? So what we're trying to say is actually that wetland is really important for so many reasons besides flood protection. It provides habitat for different species. It's huge on carbon sequestration and on and on and on. And wetlands are actually one of the highest valued ecosystems out there because of all the things they provide. And so what we're trying to provide is enough information to make an informed trade-off decision of what are the actual costs and benefits. And it can be applied in a lot of ways, ecosystem services, but that's one example.
That's such a great example. Like, I think you can really draw the purpose of it, which is to create these trade-off decisions with more information. Yeah. And I think illuminating that answer illuminates the fact that we don't value nature and we don't put monetary cost ordinarily, which is why your role exists, I assume.
Yeah. And can I just point out one? Sorry. So one thing I want to point out, because this is a question we often get when giving talks, is, well, how can you value nature if it's really priceless, right? And you should value nature for its own benefit. And we agree, totally agree, right? That it's beyond. One thing to remember is that value and price are not the same thing. So value, a human life has value, but that doesn't mean it should be or could be sold on a market. And it's the same thing with nature. It has a value, but it doesn't have a price. Like human life doesn't have a price. And so the distinction between value and price is important. And knowing that difference is important too.
How do we decide to evaluate things that, you know, as you point out, the price of something, the value of something might differ. But when something's really abstract, like well-being or, you know, the contribution of a park to mental health, how do you turn that into dollars?
There's various methods. It's been really interesting because there's a lot of work these days going on around nature and well-being, and they're correlations, basically. And so whether it's physical health or mental health, you could see the impacts directly. So for example, with physical health, besides the whole going for a run, etc., studies have found that somebody walking through a forest, there's very physical changes in their bodies. Their blood pressure goes down. They get calmer, their heart rate slows down. There's so many different things that happen physically and mentally. They've used case studies, for example. So I know when I go for a run or even for a walk, I feel better after it because of being in nature. So there's this idea of forest bathing now. I don't know if you've heard of that. I think it started in Japan, of the idea of going out to a forest and just going like, okay, I want all the foresty bathing kind of thing, you know, like just.
Do you have to be naked?
I hope not, but I don't know.
It's just like bathing. Okay, I guess it's like the metaphorical, you're surrounded, you're immersed in it.
Right. But they've done studies, for example, that prisoners having a view of nature tend to, once they're released, commit less crimes after and not come back to prison. They've showed that people in hospitals with a view of nature recover much faster. So there's been very clear studies that show the benefit of even looking at nature through a view is quite significant, both physically and mentally.
I'm gonna assume that I'm gonna have to do better than my little like pot plant, though.
Well, it's a start. So there's been studies that show that people with pets even have, and keep in mind that there's a lot of things going in here, but like people with pets tend to be slightly healthier too. And it's partially because like with a dog, you go out for walks more. So there's other things coming in, but even pets that you don't have to take for walks, people tend to be happier mentally, like mental health seems to improve.
And how do we measure that, like well-being?
So well-being. So right now, progress within society is often measured through GDP, right? Gross domestic product. And it's a really bad way to measure progress, actually. Even the guy that first developed it warned against it being used for anything besides very specific monetary exchanges. So it does things, for example, it counts everything as positive, GDP does, right? So for example, what do you think happens? Here's a question to you. What do you think happens, I know, to GDP when there's an oil spill in the long term?
So I know the answer to this because I had a great conversation with Claudia Riseborough, a feminist economist. Yeah. And I think she might have even used an oil spill example, but like, yeah, it goes up, right?
Right. So short term, it goes down, but over the long term, it goes up. Whether if you're hit by a cyclone, those areas, GDP goes up. If there's an increase, for example, in cancer, GDP goes up, right? And
because it's every transaction.
Right,
it's all positive, yeah.
More cancer, you need more doctors, you need more machines, you need stuff like that. Hurricane, sorry, I'm from the US, so hurricane is the term I use, but cyclone hits, and there's a lot of cleanup costs, right? So you need a lot of GDP and transactions to clean up, and GDP goes up. But nobody would actually argue that those were good things for society. So why should they be counted as positive? GDP also doesn't take into account a lot of things that are positive to society. So for example, a parent staying home to raise a child, it doesn't care. You having a garden and let's say eating a salad from your garden for dinner, it prefers you to go and get a frozen meal from the store, right?
Right.
Because one has a transaction, one doesn't, but nobody would say that frozen meal is better for you than salad. Volunteer work, which has been shown to have major impacts on well-being, volunteering, is not picked up by GDP, right? So all the volunteers we had over the summer fighting forest fires. That didn't matter to the progress of society, and it doesn't take into inequality. So inequality has been shown to be have a major impact on the well-being of society. There's these great books, if you're interested in reading some books. Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett wrote about 10 years ago a book called The Spirit Level, which they look at how inequality impacts societies. And then about a year ago, they published a book called The Inner Level, where they then looked at how does inequality impact an individual. And they showed that societies that have higher inequality, neuroticism is much higher, well-being is lower. So there's quite a few impacts that occur. And so GDP doesn't take any of those into effect. And there's been a lot of work done to look at how to measure well-being. And there's no perfect way to do it. Same as ecosystem service evaluation. Nobody's saying that this is a perfect way to measure well-being, but there are better ways than using GDP, right?
Right.
So there's some indicators that take GDP and try to adjust it for some of the things it does wrong. So the genuine progress indicator has been used quite a bit by some states in the US and a few parts of the world, where it tries to take away some of the things that GDP counts as positive but are really negative, include some of the positive things that are happening in society, and take into account inequality. And then there's indicators that measure well-being directly, and that's usually through surveys. So life satisfaction, right? Asking people, okay, here you go. You can answer this one. On a 0 to 10 scale, what is your overall satisfaction with your life?
Oh, it would be very high. I think it would be a 9 or 10 for me.
Right. So, and it's surprising how many people, no, that's great. But so the average in Australia is just above 7. And it's amazing how many people that say it's 0 actually, right? And so there's something going on there. So, and then there's indicators that are composite that take different aspects of maybe both the life satisfaction surveys plus GDP plus education plus other things, and
so
put
like
them
OECD
together.
Better Life Index stuff? Or?
Exactly. So that has 11 different indicators. And that has housing, jobs, opportunities, various things, education. And so that would be a composite index. So there's those 3 overall ones, but the big thing missing in society right now is a consensus on what we should use. And the problem is that every time an indicator starts floating up to the top, people are like, well, that's wrong with it, and that's wrong with it. But then you look back and you're like, well, yeah, but GDP is worse, right? So we're not going to start with something perfect. But again, going back to the adaptability, let's adapt it over time and improve it over time.
I think this is a great encapsulation of our whole conversation. It's about scale. It's about adaptability, as you point out, and figuring out how we can take these things on board. And it also reminds me of the difficulty of multiplicity. You yourself as somebody who works very hard to try to make sense of these very complex, sometimes abstract problems and offer concrete solutions and new evaluations and turning, things like parks into money so that we can make good decisions. You're also admitting that we don't have one solution, that it's about the plurality of discussion and having those robust conversations, it sounds like.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that communication between disciplines, between countries, is going to be critical in solving these problems.
Ida, it's been such a pleasure to chat with you. It's really encouraging, and I do hope that we're going to implement these solutions on an international level.
It's been great. Thanks for having me, Harry.
Great pleasure. See ya.
Bye.
You are watching The Distillery, a series of online interviews where I get to chat with amazing, incredibly talented and lovely people. New episodes are out daily, so do check back on our website, distillery.site, and you can follow us on Instagram at distillery.site and on Twitter at distillery site. Take care, everyone, and see you tomorrow.